G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and this video is intended to be a one-stop shop ultimate guide to Adobe Animate CC, formerly Adobe Flash. Now that being said, it should also be mentioned with that while I want this video to be informative and entertaining, it's going to be pretty long. So I want to make it as clear for you as possible, and in trying to do that, there's a bit of a guide up on top of my head right now which shows different time codes of the different topics that I'm going to be covering in this video. So you get a bit of an idea as to the content I'm going to be going through, but also how long it's going to take. So feel free to click above to skip ahead at any point, ahead of this intro, any of the prep stuff that I start off on. And of course, there will be links in the description to the different time codes in the video as well. Now, because I want this to be a one-stop shop ultimate guide to Adobe Animate CC, there are a few extra things I'm going to be doing throughout the course of this video to make it as informative and to facilitate your needs as much as possible. We can't cover absolutely everything in full depth. I want to cover everything as broadly as possible, but wherever we cover something where I have done another video that goes into more depth into a certain topic, I will link to it. So you can see a little pop-up video that comes across, or a little link, and you can just click that to go across and check out more if you want to learn more about those tools or utilities. The other thing that should be mentioned is I am creating this tutorial for the first ever release of Animate CC, but doubtless years from now people may come across this video and it will be slightly out of date, or there will be new features that will have come out that I haven't covered in this video. So to facilitate that, I am also going to be linking to a new playlist, which you can check out, the link on the screen and in the description as well. And on this playlist, I will have this video at the very top because it's my ultimate guide, but I will also have, in order of the newest features underneath this video, the order of the new updates and the releases that come out. So I intend to cover all the features as they're released in the different versions of Animate CC, but beyond that, in that playlist are also all of my other extensive Flash animation tutorials before Animate was released, because they're essentially the same program, but of course Animate is very specifically catering to animation and will be doing so moving forward. So I'm excited to see where the features go, and I want to make sure that anyone who sees this video in future has a direct path to see those tools and utilities that will be released in a tutorial form on that playlist. It should be said that this is a video and tutorial on a program. So we're going to cover tools, we're going to cover how to use these tools in their primitive forms, but if you're interested in learning how to animate, how to create frame-by-frame animation, how to make effective tween animation, then I highly encourage you to check out my video course, JAZZA'S Animation Foundation, which is a program agnostic video course. So if you use a different program than Animate CC, it will still be understandable and teaches the core principles of animation, but the tutorials are made using Flash, which is now Animate. So it will be pretty easy to follow along with if you want to learn how to animate and you're using Animate CC. So there's that. Make sure to check out the link on the screen and in the description. And without further ado, we're going to begin our very extensive look at Adobe Animate CC. And to begin with, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Josiah Brooks. I go online by the name Jazza, and I've been using Adobe Flash for over 13 years now. So that's over half of my life, ever since it was Flash MX. That's when I began, and it was owned by Macromedia and then later Adobe. And Adobe Flash was the cornerstone of my career, essentially. And I've created dozens of games and animations, many of which have been seen by hundreds of thousands to millions of people. I've created loads of client projects for very big and very small clients. I've found it to be an extremely comfortable and versatile program, and that's the reason I've always stuck to it, and that's one of the major reasons I'm so excited about this evolution from Flash into Animate CC. When I began this channel, pretty much all of my content, even the how to draw tutorials, were created using Flash, and one of my very early videos was an overall covering of Adobe Flash, and it's been many years since that video, and it doesn't have the best production value or quality or anything like that. So I thought, with the release of Animate CC, a lot of people are going to be looking up Animate CC who are new to animation and might not necessarily know any many of the tips and tricks that come with Flash, and there might not be very many Animate CC specific tutorials out there. So I want to put this out there nice and early for anyone who's interested in getting a real grasp of Animate CC and becoming familiar with it and its powerful tools. The first things that we're going to cover are the opening screen, which you're looking at right now, along with the workspaces and how to arrange and customize your workspaces and how to set up a project. This is what you're met with the first time you open Animate CC, and whether the layout is familiar to you or not, it's very easy to change and customize. But the first thing I want to go through is creating a new project. So you can see on the very left here, we have the option to open recent items, and this is useful, of course, if you've been using the program, but if you're new to it, there won't really be anything there. So aside from that, it might actually look a bit confusing if you open it up and you see create new and you think to yourself, I want to make an animation, and then you see the options for HTML5 canvas, WebGL, ActionScript 3, Air Desktop, all these things that don't actually say an animation project. It might seem a little confusing. The short answer would be to create an ActionScript 3 project, which essentially means it's an animation project. It plays from start to finish, but you have the option to guide the timeline and create other effects and interactive options using ActionScript 3, which you don't have to do. So don't worry about that. If you just want to make an animation, don't worry about the ActionScript 3 part. But to dive in a little bit deeper, I'm going to go down here to the bottom left where it says templates. And in clicking that, we open up this little window here and we see a whole bunch of options. So under general, I'm going to create an ActionScript 3 project, and by default, the width and height aren't usually 16 by 9, it's like 550 by 400. I've changed it to 1280 by 720, and the frame rate by default is 24 frames per second, and you can change, of course, the ruler being inches or centimeters or whatever, and the background color, but I leave it as pixels and the background color as white. And then I selected make default, which means that the default project size and frame rate now for the ActionScript 3 type is set to my settings here, and I hit OK. So as you can see, it's opened the project. If I close that and go back to my welcome screen, it means that anytime I hit ActionScript 3, it opens up a new project with exactly those settings. Now, while the resolution is 1280 by 720, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's not 1080p or that's not 4K. Well, later along the line, when you have a finished animation that you want to render, you can actually export and render into a higher resolution. So you can work at any 16 by 9 ratio, for example, 850 by 400, I think that's one, or 640 by 360, and it doesn't matter because when you export as a video, you can scale up to 4K and beyond. So the next thing we're going to do is play around with our workspace. Now, this isn't the workspace that I prefer, but I've switched it to one of the default ones just to show you how you can customize it. First and foremost, I want to show you the different customizable workspaces, and you can check this out by going down to Window and Workspaces. And at the moment, I'm in the Animator workspace. I can click on Classic and it changes the workspace to the Classic workspace, and so on and so forth through the various other workspaces. Now, to create your own workspace, you're able to click and drag these panels from the tabs here, and you can resize the tabs by clicking the side or corners of the tab and dragging them around, and by clicking and dragging this tab onto or near other tabs or on corners or sides, you can anchor them or embed them into other areas. And this enables you, for example, to put my properties panel up here on top of the timeline if I want to, move the timeline down to the bottom. The properties panel obviously works a bit more vertically, so maybe if I put it over here, when I drag it on and see this full line, it creates its own panel. But if I drag it onto another panel and highlight that whole area next to it, it will embed it as a tab inside the other tab area. So for example, the tools are all showing horizontally at the top here. I can click and drag this tab out and it will be its own little independent panel here. And my personal preference is that the tools be embedded on the left here in a vertical manner. So I can actually click and drag and pull this to the side here. And for those of you familiar with the earlier versions of Adobe Flash, this is how the tools used to come. So the reason I like to anchor it there is because of familiarity. And my familiarity also prefers the timeline up the top. On the top left here, we have the color and swatches as different tabs in the same window. I personally prefer them to lay out separately. So I'm going to take my color tab anchor it up to the top here, and then I'm going to drag my swatches tab and anchor it at the bottom. So as you can see, when I drag it onto this line here, it will go into its own area. But if I take that out and drag it into this full area here, you see it has the whole window highlighted. It's now one of these tabbed windows. Once you have your layout set up in a way that you're happy with, you can select Windows, Workspaces, and select New Workspace. You can name your workspace, hit OK, and then your workspace is saved as one of your Creative Cloud settings as well. So if you sync up here, you can see this little sync option here. It will sync to your account. So if you log in on another computer or someone else's version of Animate into your Creative Cloud, you can sync your workspaces and load your workspace through the cloud. Now I have a workspace here called JAZZA'S workspace, which I'm going to load, and this is my personal preference for my workspace. The way I like to personally have it set up is with the properties panel here on the left. I also have my libraries here underneath my properties panel, which I'll bring up here so you can see them. So I have the library and the CC libraries, both in separate tabbed windows in the same panel. Then on the right, as I mentioned, color on the top and swatches underneath the color panel. And then at the very bottom, this is a little extension. So I'll briefly cover extensions. This is a little extension called Keyframe Caddy. But if you want to add your own extensions, you can download them from the Adobe website. Make sure you're logged into your Creative Cloud account. And once they're loaded in, you'll find them under Windows, Extensions, and you'll see them there. So they're the very basics of how to set up your project and to lay out your workspace and save a workspace. If you want more information on either of these sorts of things, first I'll link you to my very old introduction to Flash, which is called Adobe Flash, The Basics. Now keep in mind this is many years old when I started the YouTube channel, so it's not quite the same as the quality of this sort of video and you know, the same presentation, but it does go through a lot of this stuff, and it might cover some different things that you'll find interesting as well. And then there is another video called Project Setup where I go through a lot of the details on creating your project and also rendering and producing in the end as well. Speaking of project setup, the very last thing I'll go through in this very beginning section of the tutorial is here under File. If we go to Publish Settings, there's this window with all these different options for what you will publish your project into. By default, it's set to tick Flash or SWF format and HTML wrapper. Now, I like to turn HTML wrapper off because I don't use it for anything. That's more of a web development interactivity sort of thing. I always render the SWF files, which once you publish, you can open them up and view them there. And that's pretty much the most relevant and useful format to constantly publish in as far as animation goes. If you're creating visual works or graphic design works, you've got GIF, JPEG, and PNG options there, and you can, of course, render with transparent backgrounds and things like that. But in the Flash format itself, you want to make sure the quality is nice and good. And this is a little thing that not many people know about. The audio stream and event qualities are by default actually quite low because they're set for web exportation. They're actually made to be rendered and put up on the internet. So you're going to want to change this. If you're creating animation specific content, you want really high quality video content, you're going to want to change this from quality to best, bitrate to the highest option there. You can leave the compression, but keep stereo as stereo instead of converting it to mono, and then hit OK. And I do this for both of these options, and that just ensures that you have the best quality render possible in your SWF export settings. The other thing, of course, is this here where we have JPEG quality. You want to bump this up if you want really high quality for your exports. And that basically means if you have images in your animation that are raster images like JPEGs or PNGs, it means that it's not going to compress them and lower the quality through the course of rendering your animation. So once you've done that, you can hit OK and they are saved to your publish settings, and then I can hit Control Save and then save this file, and I'll save it as starting up. And that's it for my intro on the opening screen and workspaces and project setup. For the next section of this video tutorial, we're going to be looking at tools and properties, very specifically two panels. This panel here, which is the tools panel, if I click and drag this out, you can see it on its own, and the properties panel. I'll click and drag this out so you can see them next to each other. The Properties panel and the Tools panel work very closely together, and you'll see that with every tool that you select, often the options change from them in the Properties panel. So for example, with the paint bucket selected, all the options for fill and stroke that are shown in the Properties panel aren't there when I have, for example, text selected as my tool. Likewise, if I select eraser, it changes different settings. It shows the published settings and more of the project property settings. But if I select ellipse or square or line or any of my other drawing tools, you'll see that the options are changed to that. So I'm going to load these back into the windows and the anchoring positions that I have them. And now I'm going to go through all of the tools in the Tools panel as extensively as possible, and also go through the various settings and applicable information in the Properties panel. So I've zoomed the screen in here so that you can clearly see the tools and properties options as I have them here on the left, just above my head. And you can see that in the Tools panel, we have these different groups. There are these dividing lines between sections of the Tools panel. So in this top area, we have various selection and manipulation tools. We'll go through them later because we can demonstrate them better once we've drawn something. Speaking of which, the next section is more of a drawing tools section. So we have the line tool, the brush tool, shape tools, and so on and so forth. Following that, we have a bit of a miscellaneous section. So there's a bone tool, which you can use to create some bone animation and deformers. There's a paint bucket, there's a ink bottle, an eyedropper, an eraser, and a width tool. Past that, there is a hand and a magnifying glass. These are stage manipulation tools, and then we have other options down here. And like the Properties panel, these options can vary based on what tool you have selected. So I'm going to start off going through the drawing tools and some of these options here at the bottom. First things first is the line tool. So you'll notice that if I'm drawing right here, I actually can't see anything, and that's because the line tool color is set to white. It's called stroke color. So I can click on that and change to any other color that I have here in my swatches. And then when I draw my line, it uses that top color rather than this paint bucket color or the fill color. If I select this box here, the rectangle tool, and click and drag, you can see that the outline is whatever I set that stroke tool to be, and then the fill color, of course, is whatever I select the fill color to be. So it's pretty straightforward stuff. Now you'll see that some of these tools have a little arrow on the bottom right of those tool icons. If you click and hold, you'll see that there are different options. So there's the rectangle tool and rectangle primitive tool. So to demonstrate the difference between these, I'm going to draw one of each. To make it nice and clear, I'm going to make the stroke, which you can see here in the Properties panel as an option, a bit thicker. So it's set to 1. I'm going to change that to 5 and hit enter. And I'm going to change my outline to red and my fill to a nice light green. Now, it should be mentioned very quickly that a lot of these drawing tool options and the way you draw with them is very similar to most other programs like Photoshop and Illustrator. So for example, if I'm drawing a square or a rectangle, it just moves with my mouse. But if I hold Shift, it moves in a very exact way. It moves in a symmetrical way, so you have to create a square while you hold Shift. The other thing too is if you hold Alt, it scales from the inside out. So if you then hold Alt and Shift, you create a square that drags out from the inside out to an exact square. So that's something to keep in mind. If you want to draw a square from the corner to corner like that, you can do so. If you want to draw the square in the middle of something and it's exactly square, then hold Shift and Alt and it will do so in a very uniform way. So I'm going to draw a square with the rectangle tool, and then moving down by clicking and dragging, I'm going to draw with the rectangle primitive tool and draw the same thing. I'll just move it here. And I just want to demonstrate the difference between these two tools, because you would think they're the same thing. When you draw with the default rectangle tool, this top one here, what you draw is actually sort of like raw art. So I can click and drag this middle fill out. If I manipulate the lines around it, it's much more easy to manipulate, but it's also easier to distort and get wrong and sort of muck up a bit. Drawing with the rectangle primitive tool essentially gives you something that's much more, what's the word, rigid or static, but at the same time it's also harder to mess up. So you're essentially clicking and dragging the piece around without worrying about messing up the fill. And also, as you can see with the selection tool changed, you can add curves to the corners. So it's easier to create simple and more uniform manipulations, but it's also harder to create more complex transitions and art edits. The other thing though to keep in mind is with the selection tool, you can actually right click and select break apart. And by doing so, it turns it into the same type of art as the actual square you've drawn. So these basic rules to the drawing tools apply to other drawing tools as well. So for example, if I go here to my oval tool, we have the same sort of option here. If I hold Shift or Alt, it draws it in different ways. And then we have the oval primitive tool, which, as you would imagine, is much like the square primitive tool, but we have some selection options, so we can create a little Pac-Man figure quite easily here, but it's harder to manipulate the internal shape and structure itself unless we break it apart like so. So ultimately you're drawing in either raw art or object drawing mode. To demonstrate this further, if I select my line tool, which I demonstrated at the start, and create a few lines in its raw drawing mode, wherever the lines intersect, we sort of break it apart and it creates a little bit more of a tricky way to manipulate. And this can be good and it can also be frustrating. As long as you know how it's drawing, it's easy to keep track of how to manipulate it. So obviously this is going to be pretty tricky to edit, where I drew some intersecting lines. But with the line tool selected, you'll see down the bottom here, underneath the paint bucket and the stroke color and all that stuff, there's this little box that says object drawing. If you click on that and then draw a bunch of intersecting lines, the lines that you draw are completely individual and they don't break when you bend them around each other. They're separate and can be manipulated as separate items. Now, why is this important? Well, because these are all separate and individual parts, it also means I can't fill in if I create a drawing. So to create a bit more of a clear demonstration, I'm going to use my pencil tool, which is essentially the line tool, but a lot more customizable. It should first be said about the pencil tool that you can change the way it draws by clicking this little button next to the object drawing mode, which shows the pencil mode. And at the moment it says straighten. Now you'll notice if I draw a bunch of organic lines and then let go, it's automatically made them much more rigid. Whereas if I change this to smooth, it smoothens it out a lot more. And then furthermore, ink means that it keeps all of the subtleties and nuances that I drew when using the pencil tool. So that's important to keep in mind. If you want something to really make rigid and clean what you're drawing without the customizability, then you can change it to straighten or smooth. But then of course, if you want to be a little more naturalistic, then ink mode makes more sense. So let's say, for example, I want to draw an eye. I'm going to draw an eyebrow and the eye and the iris and pupil and a highlight. It's not very pretty, but you get the point. But if I select my paint bucket and try and fill any of this in, I can't. Why? Well, because I drew the eye in object drawing mode, meaning with my selection tool, all of these lines are individual. And even though they intersect, they don't create fillable objects. Whereas if I have the pencil tool and turn off object drawing mode and draw the same thing, the result is something that where lines intersect, I can fill in with color because they're creating shapes that are manipulatable. It does also mean that editing is much more complicated. So, creating the lines and then manipulating after is a bit trickier than if I drew them with the object drawing mode on. So one way to go about this, if you want something that's customizable up until the point that you want to fill it in, is to draw your piece in object drawing mode. So for example, let's draw a character's face here, make it a bit bigger to clearly demonstrate what I want to talk about. Close up the gaps of his head. Let's pretend he has hair. And having used object drawing mode, it means I can easily manipulate any of these objects, even if they intersect. So for example, this line that I drew for the hair here, I could bring in there, tweak in the points, make it so they don't overlap in certain areas, things like that. And then when I'm happy with it and ready to fill it in, I can select the whole thing, right click, break apart, and then it's ready to be filled in with your fill colors, because it has turned your object drawing into raw vector art. I know this illustration is very pretty, but there's no need to be overly impressed. Just keep calm. We're talking business here. It should also be said that with each of these tools I've demonstrated, namely the shape drawing tools, the pencil tool, and the line tool, they and the ink pen tool all share the same sort of options here in the properties panel, and this is worth looking at as well. So let's say I draw an oval, and I've drawn this in the raw art drawing mode and not the object drawing mode, which has been turned off. The options for what I've drawn are here on the left, and the stroke is set to 5. I can change this to be very thick, like 20, and then the next time I draw, it's going to draw with a very thick outline. I can also change the style of the line, which means I can draw one with a dotted line. It's hard to see there because 20 has made it quite big. So if I go 2 and then draw, you'll see that I can draw with a dotted line. In fact, I'll draw a new one, like so. There are other options in here, so you can change the width style. So for example, with the line tool or pencil tool, if I draw like so, I've changed the width style to taper in at both edges, meaning that every line I draw with that stroke tapers in that way. Do keep in mind that with object drawing mode on, intersecting lines don't affect each other. Whereas if I remove this and turn object drawing mode off and I'm creating raw art, they will break each other apart and create new intersection points for each of those, where they then taper on and off in the same way from each other there. So I know I'm going through what sounds like it's very boring, but if you're not aware basically of how the object drawing mode works and how drawing raw art works, it could be a bit confusing and you might come across a few hiccups. So just be aware of that and become familiar with how the drawing modes differ. Now moving on to my personal favorite drawing tool, and that is the good old brush tool. Now this isn't the vector art brush tool or anything like that. This is the good old fashioned brush tool from the old versions of Flash. Now I'm going to drag my window up so you can see a few other extra settings down here on the tools panel. With the brush tool selected, aside from being able to have an object drawing mode like we have with the other tools, where drawing on top of and near each other means that they're individual objects that aren't one piece of art. That's good to keep in mind. But aside from that, with the brush tool selected, you'll see a bunch of other stuff, and I want to go through that with you now. So I'm going to turn off object drawing mode. We have this little lock fill thing. You don't really need to worry about that. That's referring specifically to gradients and how they appear in the shapes that you draw. So don't worry about that. What I want to focus on are these other options here. The most important one to me is this little symbol here, which says use pressure. And that's where if you're using a tablet input device, which I am, as you can see, I'm holding a Wacom pen and I'm using a Cintiq tablet. If I click this, it means that when I press lightly, and then press heavily, it changes the thickness of the line that I'm drawing. And then you can end up with some really interesting flows, and pressure sensitivity then adjusts the line width variation. Beyond that, we have brush size, where we can change it to a thicker brush, and then we have brush shape. So I could create some calligraphy artwork and write ANIMATE CC. There you go, that's my very fancy calligraphy. And that's been possible because I have the pressure sensitivity on and changed it to a bit more of a calligraphy brush there. Now, as with the other drawing tools in the tool panel, when you have the brush tool selected, there are some different options available in the properties panel linked to it. And this is important to keep in mind because you have this little tick box that says zoom size with stage. Now I believe by default it's on, and I like to turn it on and off as I need it, but it's important to know how this works. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to turn it off and select my brush size to the second biggest brush size and just draw a circle here. How this works then is if I zoom in and then draw another circle, you'll notice that the brush size has zoomed in with me. So I'll zoom in again and draw another circle, zoom in again and draw another circle. And every time I do so, the brush is staying the same size, even though the stage around it is growing. So I'm zooming out back to full size now, and if I turn this on and select zoom size with stage, it means when I draw my circle and zoom in, the next circle I draw is going to maintain the size of the original brush size. So this is good to keep in mind because it means that there are some situations where you want to work with very fine details and zoom in on your piece. You'll want to turn zoom size with stage off so you can go in there and draw some fine details. But then there are other times, for example, if you're working on characters' line art and you want to zoom in and get some of the details but maintain the same proportions of the brush stroke you're using, where you'll want to turn that back on and then it will adjust to be at the same size that you were previously working with. The last thing I want to mention in regards to the brush tool is this little option here called smoothing. Now, Adobe Animate uses a method of drawing that is called vectors. And essentially, when you draw in Photoshop or other image manipulation programs, you're drawing in a different style called raster, where it manipulates specifically pixels themselves, and there are resolution limitations. Now, with Adobe Flash, now Animate, and with another program such as Illustrator, vectors don't have the same limitations. They work in a very different way. They're actually drawing mathematically rather than with pixels and imagery. So to demonstrate this clearly for you, I'm going to select a nice thick brush and I'm going to draw a wavy line like that. Now, I drew this line with smoothing set to 50, which is the default. I'm going to turn this all the way up to 100 and draw another curvy line. And then I'm going to drag it all the way down to 0 and draw another curvy line. And I'm going to show you specifically what the smoothing tool does. Going up here to my various selection tools, I'm going to select the sub-selection tool in the tools panel and select all of these strokes. And you'll see that there are all these little dots. With the smoothing set to the default of 50, it tries to create a balance between maintaining the integrity of the line you drew and the detail it had, and minimalizing the amount of vectors used. Vectors are these little dots, which are sort of communicating with the program in some weird mathematical, magical way I don't understand, and creating the image that you drew in a visual form. But there aren't any limitations as far as resolution. You can scale this drawing infinitely and it will always maintain a nice crisp image. The next line that I drew has pretty much the same amount of vectors, but it's simplified it and it's easier to demonstrate with more complex drawings. So with smoothing set to 50, if I create a squiggle like this, and then with smoothing set to 100, if I do the same squiggle, you'll notice the amount of vectors in the first one I drew and then the amount of vectors with smoothing set to very high are very different. There's a lot less vectors with the smoothing up very high. This is trying to save memory and save space, but also create a cleaner line. And in some situations, it actually negatively affects the stroke you're trying to draw. Whereas with smoothing set to 0, the amount of vectors created isn't being optimized at all, and it exactly replicated the line you drew, but it looks a bit bumpy and there's thousands more vectors, so it's a lot more information to process. The simple reason I'm telling you this is basically you want to find a middle ground so that the lines you draw are somewhat smooth and somewhat saved on memory, but at the same time the integrity of every stroke you draw is maintained. My personal favorite is 50. It's the default, it gets the job done, and you don't need anything other than that. Now, this is probably getting quite boring. I said I'd cover everything, so I'm covering everything. They're the basic drawing tools, so I'm going to draw a quick little picture with the drawing tools, and then I'm going to use the manipulation tools and stage tools to demonstrate then how the rest of the tools and properties work. So using the default brush tool, I've drawn a little flower here. The next thing I want to cover here in the brush tool settings is this brush mode option. And this is something that I find very useful. If you select this, you can see a whole bunch of different options for how the strokes you draw with the brush tool are put into the stage. By default, it's set to paint normal. And this means that if I change color, for example, and draw like that, it's going to paint on top of whatever I drew. You can change this to be paint fills, paint behind, paint selection, and paint inside. This is really useful. My favorite version of this is paint behind, because it means that if I change color and scribble on top of my drawing, it means that whatever I draw is drawn behind what I've already created. The reason I find this useful is, say for example, if I want to color this flower, with paint behind selected, I can draw the areas that will be where the shadow are, and it won't matter if I draw on top of the lines I've already drawn. I can fill in these areas. Now you'll notice it's not filling in the entire area. That's because with the paint bucket selected, there are different options for gap sizes for what it fills in. By default, I select don't close gaps, which means that I need to fill in all of these areas so that there aren't any gaps between the vectors, and then it will fill in the areas that I've drawn, and that's how I like to create shading in my illustrations. So I've created my little flower here. There are a few things that you can do with it. You can turn it into a symbol, which we'll go into later. You can also just turn it into an object by hitting Control G, which groups it all together, and that basically turns it into that whole object drawing mode style object that you can create with shapes and such. You can do the reverse. You can create complex illustrations and then group them into one piece of art that is much easier to move around and won't manipulate or distort if I then draw on top of it or draw through it with other lines or objects. So this is extremely useful. The other type of brush there is this thing called the paintbrush tool, which is much closer to the pencil tool in function than it is to the brush itself. Reason being is if I turn on wireframe in my layer here, you'll see that I drew one single line. Whereas with the brush selected, if I turn up the brush size and draw a similar sort of line with pressure sensitivity turned on and go wireframe, you'll see that it's drawn the object with the outline being the object itself. But the benefit of the vector art brush, which is very similar or the same as the Illustrator vector art brush, is you have the option to create different aesthetics. So if you go to Windows and open up the brush library, you get this panel here where you can find different things like, let's say, arrows. If you double click on that, it means that whenever you draw a line with your vector art brush, it creates that fancy vector art as your stroke. Now you'll see that the shape has been manipulated because the width style has been changed to taper at both ends. I'm going to change that to default, and then you'll see that it draws the object the way it was meant to be drawn. So I can delete all those, and using the vector art brush, I can create some stylistic effects. So let's say for the flower here, I can find one of these stylistic arty brushes and draw, let's say a charcoal feather stem to this flower. And you can create loads of effects with this. So for example, if I load in charcoal smooth and draw a bunch of lines like this, I've created a tuft of grass. I can select this tuft and copy and paste it and spread it along the bottom here. With the same vector art brush, I can go to decorative, elegant curls and such, and then there's cloudy half. If I double click on that, I can draw little clouds in the sky. And of course, if you want to change the size with your selection tool, the shortcut is V, you can select these clouds that you've drawn and change the stroke, which changes the thickness of the object you've drawn. The same can be applied to all of the grass stems that I've drawn. I can of course change the color to any of these. So we'll make the grass nice and green. We'll make the stem of the flower a darker green. We can make the clouds a very light gray. And although it's very simple, now I have this little image that is easy to manipulate because the art is all individual. Everything is drawn separate to one another, and it's easy to sort of move around and change. Now, even though this is all drawn on a single layer, you can change how it's all presented. So I could click and drag and select the stem and the flower, right click, and under arrange I can send to the front, which means that then it will appear in front of all the other things I've drawn in this layer. And I might want to do that to the flower itself, which means it will appear on top of the stem. So you can move things back and forwards on top of or behind each other in the one layer. But of course, everything is much easier to manipulate and change and stuff when it's in an object mode or as a symbol. The last things I want to talk about are the stage manipulation and the transform tools. So once again, back up to the top here, I've sort of shown the selection tool, which again, shortcut is V, and I highly encourage you to become familiar with all the various keyboard shortcuts. You can see the shortcuts of the tools when you mouse over them, and there's the in brackets, the keyboard shortcut next to them. So the keyboard shortcut for brush is B, keyboard shortcut for free transform is Q. So all of the selection tools work in different ways. The default selection tool, keyboard shortcut V, selects the object in a pretty clean way, and it's easy to go from object to object. To demonstrate the difference between the selection tool and the sub-selection tool, I'm just going to move across here and I'm going to copy and paste my flower and break it apart into the raw art. With the selection tool, you'll notice it's just got this mesh overlay to show that I've selected it. But with the sub-selection tool, then when I select all of this flower, you can see and edit and manipulate all of the vectors. I very rarely use the sub-selection tool. It's most useful when I'm manipulating lines. Otherwise, it's a little bit too over the top and unnecessary. The free transform tool is essentially the same as the default selection tool, but you have a bounding box and a pivot point. This is really useful, and the free transform tool is one of the most used manipulation tools that I use. So for example, if I select this flower with the free transform tool, I can scale it and drag it. I can, with my mouse on the outside of the bounding box, rotate the object, and if I move this pivot point, which is this little white dot here, I can move that anywhere, and then the rotation and the scaling will be anchored to that position, to the pivot point placement that I create. As far as selection goes, then you have 3D transformation, which means that you can essentially rotate things in a three-dimensional way, but that's pretty much more applicable when you have motion selected in the motion tweens. Then we have this selection tool here, which has the option to go between the lasso tool, the polygon lasso, and the magic wand. These work the same as they do in other programs, so if you've used Photoshop or Illustrator, you'll be familiar with how they work. I'll just briefly cover the rest of these things. So for example, we have text, and I can write hello. In the properties panel on the left, I can change the alignment, the size of the text, the font of the text, and these are all able to be synced with the Adobe typekit fonts that you can get. Now, getting rid of everything except for my lovely flower here, the last thing I want to go through is the stage manipulation stuff. So this little hand tool, and then if you click and hold, there's also the rotation tool where you can rotate the canvas. This is new to Animate CC and is very useful. If you rotate the canvas like I have done here and want to reset it, there's this little button here on the right that says center stage. Click on that and it will reset your stage. Now, as I mentioned, getting used to keyboard shortcuts is very important. So for example, you might be drawing and then you might want to move slightly around the stage. You don't want to go over to the hand tool or the rotation tool manually, move slightly and then go back to your drawing tools. You want to stay in your drawing tools. So for example, if I draw the flower and then I want to go over to the other side of the flower, rather than manually selecting, you can hold space, which means then I can click and drag and move around the stage, or holding space shift means I can rotate the stage without actually moving to those tools. The last thing I'll mention is this little snap to objects option here. So if I have the line tool selected and I'll turn the brush into my default line brush, when I draw with this with snap to objects off, it means if I get very close to other lines I've drawn, there's no real way to know it's connecting so that I can fill in art, for example. But with it turned on, it means that I will be snapping to the vectors or the lines of other objects I've drawn. And this can be useful, and again, it can be not useful. So it's important to know where it is and how you can turn it on and off. So that will do for the tools and the properties. Obviously it took a long time to cover all of that, but I wanted to make sure to get in as much of that info as possible. But then of course there is obviously the fact that I haven't covered the bone tool. That's because that is a very extensive kettle of fish in itself. So make sure to check out the video I've done on the bone tool. The link is on the screen and in the description, and that goes into detail and shows you how to animate with the bone tool and does all of that. But we don't really have the time to jump into it in this video because it's going to be a long enough video as it is. So make sure to check out that, but otherwise that's pretty much it for the tools and properties. Whew. For this next section, we're going to talk about drawing and coloring in. Now, we have gone through the tools that you can use to draw in a fair amount of detail. So in terms of finding your own style and the way you want to go about it, I recommend playing around and finding what's comfortable. But when we start to learn how to use the drawing tools in Flash, we're also going to want to slowly become familiar with the timeline, which is this big long thing with lots of numbers on it. Reason being is it's important to become familiar with drawing on different layers and creating symbols. So we'll go into detail into that later, but for now, I'll go into some of the very minimal basics. And one of those basics is adding new layers, which you can do like so by clicking the new layer little button there. You can also create folders and group layers into folders, and of course use the little trash can to delete. So you might, for example, draw a background on this very back layer, draw a midground or some props on a layer above, draw a character and some foreground objects, and the list goes on. The topmost layers appear at the front of the playing experience, so anything you draw on a topmost layer is going to be visually in front of anything underneath those layers the same as any layer system in other drawing programs. We'll go into detail into all the different aspects of the timeline later on, but basically I wanted to touch on that because it's important to know how to draw into different layers. But really now I want to use the drawing tools that I've already described, so I won't explain what I'm doing as I use them. Really I want to focus on this area here on the right, and this is the color section. It might be in a different location depending on how you have your stage set up, but the two main panels I'm talking about here are the color panel and swatches panel. So I'm going to use these 5 layers that I've created to draw parts of a character's body. I might have one layer for the legs, one layer for the torso, and so on. And I'm going to speed up through the process so you can see me do it very quickly, but you will notice that sometimes the drawing I draw will turn into a wireframe mesh. The way this happens is that once I've drawn into a frame on a layer, I can click this little color area here to turn it into a wireframe mesh. And the reason this is useful is it means that I can draw in a layer on top of that without the visual distractions of the layer underneath. The other thing you can do, of course, is lock that wireframed or unwireframed area, and it means that I can't erase or click and drag or do anything to that section that will manipulate or delete it, aside from deleting the entire layer itself. And the other option is clicking this little dot here under the eye, which means it will hide that layer. So I've created a little illustration of a character here using these 5 layers. I'm going to break down how I use the 5 layers. On the very bottom layer, I have this sketch, and I nearly always use a bottom layer with a very light gray brush to create a very rough sketch of what I'm going to draw. And that's the best way to go about it, because in creating a construction base means you have something to follow that gives you some guidance, and you can refine that and play with that until you're ready to draw the final art. Then on top of that, I created 4 layers of character art. One layer is the feet, which appears underneath the body, which has on top of that some arms, and then on top of that the head itself. And I can then go ahead and hide my rough sketch, and then we have our finished vector art. Now the reason it's great to have all of these in separate layers is it means now I can select the head and move it around, and it means that the art I've created is now much more ready to be animated. And we're going to get to the animation stuff later, but hopefully you get the idea that by creating things in a specific way, so it's easy to be manipulated and segmented apart from each other, you can then create some much more customizable animation that's easy to differentiate from each other and the other artwork around it in the project. Now we're going to get to animation and all that fun fancy stuff later. The way I drew this character uses the same methods I explained through the tools and properties section, basically just by using the default brush tool and then filling in with my painting in and filling in method. But now I want to get to the color panel and the swatches. Whenever you select the eyedropper, and again, keyboard shortcuts are very useful, so by hitting I, you can select the eyedropper. By clicking on a color, it adds it to your palette if it isn't already there. So by eyedropping this blue, it's added it to my swatches palette at the bottom. And you can see that the skin colors are already at the bottom there as well. If I select the eyedropper for the shorts, you can see it's actually just highlighted a color in my default swatches, and that's because I used one that already existed rather than creating a new color by clicking and dragging this area up here. I should also mention that you can change the way the colors are presented. So the way that this is showing here is different to what you might be seeing, because I think it's set to this by default, which is sort of confusing to me. You can select these little dots here on the right to change the different color selection method, and I prefer this top one which says H. I don't know what that means, but I like that one. In this color section, you can also change the way that the color is built. So you can turn it from a solid color into a linear gradient. The way a linear gradient works is you can have one or more shades within a linear gradient, and it's going to change throughout. So let's change his hair to a linear gradient. We'll find a similar sort of reddish color and we'll put it in both sections of the linear gradient, but we'll have one of those sections lighter than the other, and I can paint that gradient into the object. Now my paint bucket icon has a lock on it, so if I click here, I can turn off lock fill, and that means now I can click and drag and change the way the gradient is drawn. And that's going to make it look a lot nicer because I can position the gradient. If you want to further manipulate the gradient, up here at the top left under the free transform tool, if you click and hold, you can go to the gradient transform tool, where once you click on a gradient, you can move and resize and rotate your gradient to be positioned exactly how you want it to. Just like any other swatches, you can put them into your panel. So you can also click this little button here that says create new swatch, and it means that my gradient that I have selected is now able to be selected here. If you have another project and you want to carry all of your swatches across into another project, open this little panel on the top right and go down to save colors. And you can save your color swatches, and we'll call this example swatches. Hit enter. And now when I open a new project with my default settings, I can, in the same area, go add colors or replace colors and enter my example swatches, and you can see the same colors now appear that were in my other project. But the next thing I want to demonstrate is one of my favorite features that's new to Animate CC, and that is something called tagged swatches. This is essentially where you can select a color that you already have, let's say the blue of his shirt, and by clicking this little icon here that says create tagged swatch, you can name it, let's say shirt, hit enter, and here at the bottom in a folder called tagged swatches, we have this funky little blue icon. It has a different outline. The reason tag swatches are really cool is you can change them on the fly, and wherever they have been painted, they will be replaced by the changes that you've made. So for example, if I double click on tag swatches and change the color to a green, hit OK, it will change the shirt color to green. But you'll notice it hasn't done it in my illustration. The reason is I actually haven't painted the tag swatch in. So I'm going to undo that change, select my tag swatch and paint it onto Billy's shirt. And now if I make the change to green and hit OK, his shirt color is changed to green. This is really cool. Now, I personally like to build tag swatches around a character from the very beginning, which means that when I use them and paint with them throughout the process of the animation, I can change them on the fly and at any time, and they will be replaced throughout the entirety of the animation. And this is really cool because it's hugely time saving, especially when you do a lot of frame by frame animation. To demonstrate the importance of this and the flexibility of it, this is a scene that I'm animating for a personal project of mine. So as you can see inside this project, there's a lot of frame by frame animation happening inside these clips, and this entire character was built with tag swatches, and you can see all of his tag swatches on the right here. I can go through and manually change all of the colors of these tag swatches, and it will change throughout the entirety of the animation. So let's make his skin nice and pale. We can make his eyes a little darker. We can change his hair color to be something ridiculous like blue if we want to, and change his clothes to a little bit more of a pinkish color, maybe change the gold to a green. Now this is a ridiculous demonstration because these are never colors that I would pick, but you can see very clearly that through the course of all that frame by frame animation, because I constantly painted using those tag swatches, it has replaced them with the colors that I've changed it to. This is hugely time saving, and it's really important to get used to using tag swatches because it's going to save you a lot of heartache and time and problems in the future if you become familiar with them. So I'm going to close this, and the last thing I'll mention in regards to tag swatches is that if you want to copy these tag swatch colors into another project, you need only copy the objects which have the tag swatches applied to them and paste them into another project. So for example, let's create tag swatches of Billy's skin colors and his hair, hit OK, his pants and his shoes. I'm going to now apply the tag swatch colors because they haven't been applied to him. So now our Billy character is made up entirely of tag swatches. So I can change his skin color on the fly. I can change his hair color, including gradients. So you can have a gradient as a tag swatch, and the shirt color as I previously demonstrated. And to copy all those tag swatches into another file, I need simply copy him, go across and paste, and you'll see that the tag swatches have appeared here. And I can create changes with the same flexibility in this project as I had in my previous one. So I'm going to close that because that's demonstrated what I needed to demonstrate. So that's the extent to which I'm going to cover the drawing tools and coloring in Animate CC. If you want to find out a little bit more or see me cover it in a little bit more time and detail, you can check out the video how to color in Flash. Again, this is a very old video, but it does go through coloring methods and gradients and radial gradients and some other things I may not have gone to in this video. So feel free to check that out with a link on the screen and in the description. In this next section of the tutorial, I'm going to go through the timeline and the utilities. We're going to be specifically focusing on this area up the top here, which is the timeline panel. Now we've briefly gone through the layers and how they work through our drawing section, basically adding new layers, creating a folder, locking and wireframing and hiding these layers we've sort of mentioned. Now we're going to focus on this area in here and this panel at the bottom. This area in here is the timeline itself. Each of these numbers represents the frame number of the piece. Now this piece is running at 24 frames a second. So when we have more than the one frame we have at the moment, every time one frame passes when you play through, it is 1/24th of a second. So I'm going to select up here at frame 100 and I'm going to hit F5. That's a shortcut. The long way to do this is to right click and you can go insert frame and that sort of drags it out to there. The other manual way to do this is if you hold Control, you can click and drag the duration of the end of this frame by clicking on that little square thing when you have Control selected, which is at the end of the frame. Once again, keyboard shortcuts are very important. So F5 is the way to add frames. So now the duration of my movie, my animation, is 100 frames long because I've added 100 frames. All of these layers have 100 frames and I can have different lengths of frames for all of the layers, and that's sort of getting a bit more complicated, but it's inside this area here that the animation can be created. Now at the very start, you'll see that there's this little black dot in the bottom left of each of these long lines over that layer duration. This represents the start of a keyframe. So a keyframe represents where the illustration or drawing takes place, and it's by making and using and manipulating these keyframes, these frames with the dots on them, that you can create an animation. To create a duplicate keyframe, let's say here at frame 10, I can select all of these and hit F6 and that creates a duplicate keyframe. What that means is it's created a new keyframe here in the timeline with the exact same art that I previously had. Why is this important and what does that mean? Well, it means I can manipulate all the parts of this character on all of these different layers, just making some minor adjustments like so. And the result is then, if I go back to the previous frames, the art has changed on this timeline. And this is really important because it's by making these incremental changes or drastic changes that the animation takes place. Now we're going to go specifically into the animation process later. I just wanted to demonstrate what a keyframe is and how to duplicate that and what that means. Once again, keyboard shortcuts are very important. So F5 is to add keyframes. You can do this at the end of your timeline where there are no keyframes. You can also do it in the middle of a timeline. So if I have no frames selected and move my cursor over into this area here and hit F5, it adds keyframes to all of the layers and pushes it all out based on where my cursor is. Alternatively, I can select a frame or a keyframe and hit F5 and it will only add frames to that layer that I've selected. So I'm going to undo that because I'll just keep it all uniform. The next keyboard shortcut that I'm going to get you to keep in mind is F7. So if I go to frame 20 and select all of these and hit F7, that deletes everything and creates what's called a blank keyframe. You'll see it looks different on the timeline here as well, and that's because there's no art. These little dots on the bottom left of the timeline have no fill. They're not black dots, they're outlined dots. But once I draw anything on the stage, all of a sudden it's got a fill and it's a keyframe. So I'm going to delete that, but they're the main three shortcuts I want you to remember. F5 is to add frames, F6 is to create a duplicate keyframe, and F7 creates a blank keyframe, stopping it at where the cursor is or where you've selected and deleting it at the start of that keyframe. The next very important keyboard shortcuts that I use all the time, and I highly recommend you get used to, are the keyboard shortcuts to go back and forward through frames with your keyboard. The keyboard shortcut for this is full stop and comma. Or if you hold shift, it's the more than and less than symbols, and it's an easier way to remember because they're like little arrows that you can use to go back and forward through the frames. So pressing these a few times or in repetition or back and forth is essentially the equivalent to when traditional animators have a handful of paper and they're rocking it back and forward to see the motion. So once you have several frames of animation, you can rock back and forward using these keys and test the motion out and see how it's looking. It's a really useful thing to keep in mind. There are play controls here at the bottom of the timeline, and as you might imagine, hitting play plays through the timeline, but I don't recommend using them. I recommend using the keyboard shortcuts. The keyboard shortcut to play is enter, and you can hit enter again to stop. And then of course they have the manual options to rock back and forward, which I've just mentioned, but again, use the keyboard shortcuts. There are some other controls here at the bottom of the timeline. This one's really important. It's called loop, and if I select this, you'll see that there's this weird little bar that shows up near the cursor area on the timeline. By bringing your mouse over these little dot areas, you can click and drag the duration of this loop area, and it means now when I play inside it, it's going to play within the space that I've set up, and it's going to repeat itself. This is really useful, especially when creating things like character walk cycles where they're moving along and doing something with emotion. It means you're able to see it in repetition in sort of a semi-context and see how it feels. Next along this panel, we have some other options. There's this one called onion skin. This might not make much sense to you if you turn it on and it creates some weird shapy things and there's colored dots up here. It's the same sort of layout as the loop one when I have that turned on, but it acts in a very different way. The onion skin shows a translucent overlay or underlay of the previous frame or the next frame. Now both are manipulatable, so I can click and drag and show several previous frames or many later frames, or I can click and drag it to just show one frame on either side. This is particularly useful with frame by frame animation because it means that you can see the previous frame without it existing in the keyframe you're drawing and draw the next frame of animation. This next icon is the onion skin outlines. It acts the same way as the onion skin, but instead of a transparent overlay, it turns it into a colored green or blue outline. Green being the upcoming frame and blue being the frame that you've just passed. And then finally we have this other icon, which is edit multiple frames. And essentially it means that anything that falls inside this area, you can select and move or manipulate, and it moves and manipulates everything all at once. So that's how they work. That's pretty much everything I want to cover in terms of the timeline and utilities. The last thing I want to mention is copying and pasting content. So for example, by default, you would assume that if I want to copy this character and add him to a place later in the timeline, I would click and drag or hit Control A and then copy and then move later in the timeline and hit paste. But that doesn't quite work for a few reasons. One is that when I've copied and pasted it, it's copied and pasted it all onto one layer, which now means it's a flat artwork. I can't select the head and the body and the arms separately. The other thing it does is when you hit paste, it just pastes it into the central position based on where your screen is at the time. So you'll notice if I rock back and forth between these frames, his position has shifted. So it's important to keep in mind that there's a big difference between copying and pasting content on the stage and copying and pasting frames. If you want to copy and paste content of layers and frames themselves, you can click and drag and select either one layer on one frame or multiple layers on one frame or multiple frames and multiple layers. And you can right click and select copy frames or cut frames, and then later on you can paste. Now again, keyboard shortcuts are very important to me. So I would instead select the area, and I might just select the first frame of all the layers and hit Control-Alt-C. Control-C would copy the content of the stage. Control-Alt-C copies the content of the timeline, which maintains all of the layers and all of the positions on the stage. And if I go to, let's say, frame 40 and hit Ctrl-Alt-V, it's pasted just that one frame with all those layers. I can extend this, of course, by hitting F5, and that extends the duration. And this is really useful, and it can be used for lots of things. So say, for example, if I want to shorten the duration of my entire animation just to be these 19 frames, I can select all of that, hit Ctrl-Alt-C, and then select all of the frames and layers in the entirety of the project very quickly by hitting Ctrl-Alt-A, which selects all of the timeline and layers, and then hit Ctrl-Alt-V to paste only the area I selected. And that's a very useful trick that I use quite a lot. So once again, the Control Copy, Control Paste, Control Select All, whatever, is just for the stage, and then Control Alt, Copy, Paste, and Select All is for the timeline itself. So I'm going to reset my timeline here just by Control Alt C, copying and pasting the first frame, and as you can see, I've shortened it to one frame. I'm going to drag this all out to frame 100 again, but basically now I have one piece of art that I'm going to work with, and next we're going to go into animation. So that is it for the timeline and utilities part of this tutorial. So finally, oh my god, we have arrived to the animation part of the tutorial. Now, I said I would be as in-depth as possible, and I guess that means that this has been quite literally one of the longest videos I've ever done on my channel. That being said, at the end of the day, Animate is all about animation, and we've finally arrived to the part where we get to animate. Now, there are different kinds of animation that you can work with. The most well-known method of animation is called frame-by-frame animation, and that has existed since the beginning of televised animation, and that is drawing one frame and then redrawing with some slight changes on the next frame, and that process is repeated until you slowly go insane. The next method of animation has been popularized through digital animation, and that's called tweening, which is where you can take one piece of art or object that you've drawn and move it from point A to point B over a set duration, and it will move the object rather than have you redraw it to create that motion. Another type of animation is called shape tweening, which uses the same idea of a motion tween, moving something from A to B, except it transforms the shape itself from one shape into another. Now that sounds really cool, but it's actually much more difficult to control than you might imagine, and we'll go into that slightly later on. I really want to focus on tweens and the frame-by-frame animation. So I'm going to take this character here and we're going to animate him, and to do this we need to first understand how symbols work, because we're going to use those to create the animation. Now what we have on all these different layers are raw artwork of the character broken up into their various parts. Now, as I mentioned in the drawing part of the tutorial, you can manipulate and change and tweak the artwork, you can change the colors, you can edit or delete chunks of the character, but you don't really necessarily want to do that once you get to the animation part. You may want to simply be able to click on the head, select it, and move it, but at the moment I can't do that. There are several ways to do that, and the method I mentioned in the drawing and tools and properties section of the tutorial was that you can hit Ctrl-G, and that turns it all into a group that you can, select and move and manipulate fairly easily. Now that's all well and good, but it doesn't serve our needs as far as animation goes as well as symbols do. So I'm going to undo this until I have my raw head artwork, and to create a symbol you can right click and select convert to symbol, or you can use the keyboard shortcut, which is F8. And now this is easy to remember because F5, 6 and 7 are the keyframe manipulations, and then after that F8 is the symbol conversion shortcut. Now you can see when you convert something to a symbol you can name it, so I can call this character head, and as you can see there's a drop down menu next to type, so you can select symbol types. This can get a little bit confusing and complicated, so I'm going to keep it as straightforward as possible, and for now I'm just going to turn this into a movie clip and hit OK. Now you'll notice what's happened is over here on the left in my library, his little head has appeared. When you create a symbol, you add it automatically to your library. This means that you can click and drag it from your library to the stage, you can use it repetitiously, you can enter it inside this library clip to manipulate it or edit it as you wish. But do keep in mind, if I delete it in the library, it deletes it in every instance it appears. So if you have a symbol, it's going to be in the library. I'm going to turn these arms into a symbol. I'll call them arms, hit enter. I'm going to select the body and I'll call it body, hit enter. And I'm going to select the legs, but I'm going to turn this into a graphic and I'll explain the difference between the movie clip and the graphic when I get through animating them. Call this legs and hit enter. Now, one of the main reasons symbols are very useful for animation is that they all are like timelineception. They all have their own timelines inside the timeline. So for example, if I select the head, which is in this top layer here, as you can see in the main timeline, which is outside of everything, there are 100 frames, and this head has 100 frames on the main timeline. But if I double click to enter the head symbol, you'll see that things have changed a little bit. The timeline has reset completely, and everything around this head, everything that isn't this head symbol, is faded. Basically, this means we have entered into the head symbol and it has its own timeline. And this is really cool because it means that I can create some animation in here and it will play and replay inside its own timeline and on the main timeline. So for example, I might create 50 frames of animation and I might add another layer, and at frame 20, I might want him to blink. So to create this effect, I'm going to create a new frame. So to create this effect, I'm going to create a new keyframe on frame 20 on a layer above my original artwork. Now I don't want to in any way edit or change my original raw artwork, and because I'm inside the movie clip of the head, the imagery of the head is now its original raw artwork and can be manipulated. So I'm going to lock the head's artwork and wireframe it so it's easy to sort of see around and on top of. And I'm going to draw the keyframes of the blink. So on frame 20, I'm going to draw an eyelid slowly going down on both sides of the head and have the bottom eyelid also start to come up. I'm now going to hit F7, which creates a new keyframe, but as you can see, I have no point of reference. I can rock back and forth and I have a single solitary keyframe on frame 20 of the eyelids starting to go down, but then they disappear. This is where onion skin comes in handy. I can select onion skin and now I have a reference for my previous frames, and I can draw the eyes slowly closing further into the head. And this is where the process repeats itself. By hitting F7 again, I create a new keyframe. I can see the previous two keyframes. I can draw the eyelids closing more. I want to make sure things are even. At the moment, the eyes aren't very even. And then I'm going to hit F7 and draw the frame where the eyes are completely closed. Now, as you might imagine, if I turn off my onion skin and turn off the wireframe, I have this very weird looking thing because the eyelids have no solidity. So I'm going to wireframe my art underneath, and selecting my tagged swatch for the shadow skin color, I'm going to select paint behind and I'm going to simply fill in the area. And I want to make sure that it appears without covering the line areas that I don't want it to cover. So I'm going to continue this process, moving to the next frame, filling in the areas. You see I'm drawing around the nose here so that the line work underneath still shows. On the next frame, do the same thing. And this is once again where the process becomes repetitive until we have the fourth frame where the eyes are completely shut. So I can just fill all of this in and I'm covering my original open eye artwork. And now when I reveal everything and I rock back and forward between these frames, you can see I've created the animation of an eye closing. So it would stand to reason that the next thing to do would be do the process in reverse. So for example, create a new blank keyframe, turn on the wireframe and start to draw the eyes opening. But you want to economize your time in animation and you don't want to draw more than you have to. So I'm going to select Ctrl-Alt-C to copy the second last frame and paste it at the end here. Then I'm going to do the same for the second frame from the start, paste it on the next frame at the end. Then select my very first new keyframe, Ctrl-Alt-C, and then at the very end, Ctrl-Alt-V to paste it, and then hit F7 to delete the artwork in the next keyframe. And then the result is we have a closing and opening eye. and a character that is blinking. The result of this is that if I hit Control Enter, which is the shortcut to render, you're able to view the result in context, and you see we have this character which has a blinking eye animation. Now I know this is blowing your mind. I know this is the best animation you've ever seen, but keep calm. It's only going to get better. So that's the entire animation in context, but beginners to the program will notice and probably be confused by the fact that if they go out to the main timeline and hit play, there is no animation happening. Why is that? The reason for that is movie clips act very different to graphics. So for example, I'm going to go through this process very quickly with the legs to demonstrate the difference between movie clips and graphics. So I'm going to enter my legs symbol, and as I mentioned previously, these are a graphic symbol and not a movie clip symbol. I'm going to extend the timeline to 30 frames, and I'm actually going to duplicate this entire layer. So I'm going to copy the keyframe of the entirety of the art of the legs onto 2 layers. On the bottommost layer, I'm going to hide the top layer and delete one of the legs, and then I'm going to swap and hide the other layer and delete the other leg. And now that means if I reveal both layers, I have 1 layer for each leg. That now means that I can select frame 10, for example, of layer 1, which shows the leg on the right, hit F7, and I've created a new blank keyframe for that leg only. Now I'm going to turn on onion skin and draw a leg in a different position. So let's have the foot, which is now tapping, and he's going to raise his foot and then he's going to later lower his foot. I'm going to paint in my colors with my tag swatches, and I'm going to copy and paste that first keyframe at the end here, and then we have a tapping motion. Now it's not very smooth, so I'm going to create something called an in-between. How this works is I create a new blank keyframe between 2 frames. I know this might be very confusing to some of you starting off. So basically there are 2 frames of different artwork. At the end here, I'm going to hit F7, and between them is a blank frame. If I go onto this blank frame and turn on my onion skin, I can then select my brush and draw between them. It might be easier to see sometimes if you select onion skin outlines, and then you can simply draw your new lines on the frame in between them, so that will soften the motion and it will create a much smoother looking animation. So I'll paint in my colors, and you can repeat this multiple times. So I can drag this keyframe across, create 2 new blank keyframes, and in these frames between the artwork, the motion is much less drastic, and I can create another piece of artwork with the drawing between the positions of the geometry of the first and second frame. Then I'll turn off my wireframe and I'll paint the insides of the art for these layers. And then, as you can see, we have a motion with the foot moving up that is much smoother than when we had just the original 2 frames. So I've done something called creating in-betweens. Another thing you can do is have it so the animation plays out on what is called doubles. So that's where I can just click and drag these keyframes so that there are 2 frames for every keyframe, and that means the motion is slowed down so that it's essentially playing at 12 frames per second instead of 24. And then I can copy this and do the same thing I did with the facial animation. I can paste these frames in reverse on doubles to create that motion of going in and out of a position. So that's how you create frame by frame animation using in-betweens and keyframes as reference. Now back to my original point, I was going to talk about the difference between symbols, specifically graphic symbols and movie clip symbols. So if I play here in the main frame, as you can see, the foot is playing its animation and the face is not. That's because movie clip symbols always play but aren't revealed in the main timeline because they're not limited by the main timeline's length or parameters. The graphic symbols are limited by the main timeline's parameters. So to demonstrate what I mean, if I remove everything except for frame 1 in the main timeline and do my render, you'll notice only the head has its animation and the legs don't. That's because we're still stuck on frame 1 in the main timeline, but the movie clip continues to play its entire 50 frames of animation that we've created inside itself, the graphic clip is stuck on the first frame of animation inside itself. Now, I would love to demystify this for you more because it is a bit complicated to wrap your head around, but once you understand it, it's much easier to sort of work with. But again, I could spend much more time explaining and breaking down the reason for the differences between these two symbols. But rather than doing that, I'm going to lead you to a video I did called How Flash Symbols Work. So check that out. That breaks apart the difference between movie clips and graphics in great detail in a way that you can understand. And it also explains the purpose and functions of the third type of symbol, which we haven't mentioned, which is the button, which we don't really need for animation. So, you know, but if you're curious and you want to demystify any of this, make sure to go check out that video to learn a bit more about it in depth. Now, something important to keep in mind is you can change the type of symbol. You can either do this in the library itself. So for example, if I want the character head to be a graphic instead of a movie clip, if you right click and select properties, you can change the type to a graphic and hit OK. Now that changes the type in the library only and not on the instances where it is in the stage. So if I select the head here in the properties panel, it still says movie clip here. You can actually still change it on the stage itself and select graphic, and that means now it will play through the animation on the main timeline because the type of the symbol of the head has turned into a graphic symbol. Now you can animate characters in the main timeline, of course. You can create new keyframes. I could create a new keyframe of this character's animation and redraw him in a different pose and do all of that. But the reason I like to work inside of symbols is it allows you to work in both frame by frame and tween animation in a way that's nice and smooth. So for example, I can select the head. If I move the pivot point with the free transform tool selected down here to the neck, now when I rotate, he rotates at the point where the neck meets the head. And I can add keyframes at frame 15 and 30, move the head slightly on frame 30 and create a tween between these two positions. Now we haven't gone into tweens yet. To do so, you right click and create a classic tween, and that creates the type of tween that I find most easy to work with. You can also create something called a motion tween, which in the newer versions of Animate and Flash work a little bit different. It enables you to use 3D transformation and to change positions of frames and change motion options fairly easily, but it's also a bit more complicated and hard to understand in my personal experience. So I personally prefer the classic tween, and to add those, you just right click and select create classic tween, and it just moves it from point A to point B. Now, if I want to return his head to the normal position, I might create a duplicate keyframe on frame 50 and at frame 70, click and drag it to return it to an upright position. The problem is, even though I might create this tween, if I go back to frame 1, the position might be slightly different as it is here because I just tried to eyeball it. Now, there are a few ways you can try and fix this. You can try and eyeball it and move it to a position manually, but you'll most likely get it wrong. Some people might then be tempted to Control-Alt-C and Control-Alt-V or copy and paste that keyframe from the start, but you'll see that where he was going to be blinking at frame 70, if I paste from the start, the animation is reset and the blinking doesn't happen. That's because it has reset the internal animation to be where it was on the frame that I copied it. So to explain this, if I select my selection tool and click on the head and scroll down in the properties section, you can see under looping, it's playing from the first frame rather than from the frame it was up to. So because it had played through 50 internal frames and then reset at frame 1 on frame 51, by frame 70 internally, the head should be playing at frame 20, if that makes sense, because it's looped after frame 50. And you can change this under the looping section, type in 20 and hit OK, and now it will continue to play from where it was. Now, I completely understand that I may have confused the crap out of you. I apologize for that. I'm going to try and help break this down now into leading into other content that does so in a very clear way using examples. The first video I want to link you to is called Advanced Flash Animation Made Easy. So go check that out. It goes through frame by frame animation. It goes through tweens and adding eases to tween to make motion look more natural and organic. And it also further explains the way the internal and external structure of graphic symbols works, but in a bit more of a context than the symbol link that I sent you to before does. The next video I want to link you to is a tutorial called How to Animate a Transformation. That video is much more specifically aimed at frame by frame animation. And in that video, we animate from one form into another. So we animate a transformation from Bruce Banner into the Hulk, and it shows how to animate frame by frame through that process and shows a few cool little tips and tricks sort of along the way. So that brings us to the end of our animation section in this tutorial. I know it's been very simple and we've created this very basic character animation here, which you can test by doing this, by hitting Control Enter and previewing the render. The last thing I want to mention in regards to doing the animation is there are a couple of other things that you can use in this timeline area for animation. And one is when you right click, you can create a mask, which means that you can hide and show things based on the core mask layer. Works the same as masks do in Photoshop and Illustrator, and this can be very useful, and I do go into detail in that in the shape tween tutorial. So if you're curious on how to apply masks in animation, go check that out. Another thing to keep in mind is the thing called guides, which is specifically useful for motion tweens, because you can create a guide motion path that something can follow. So for example, if you create a motion path that looks something like this, you can then tween a ball that will bounce along that path. For more detail on how guides work and on how to create organic looking motion tweens, I recommend you check out a video I did called How to Animate a Bouncing Ball, which is a much more beginner friendly way of learning how animation works, how to use guides, and how to use motion tweens. So I highly recommend that one. Check that one out, link on the screen and in the description. But the other useful application of guides isn't necessarily for motion, but also for references. So to illustrate what I mean, I have all of these layers, but underneath them all, I still have my sketch. Now, normally once I finish my art, I could just delete this and be done with it, but there may be instances, say with an animatic, where I still want to reference it or bring it back later. A cool way to use the guide option is to right click and turn a layer into a guide, and it means that even though it's visible in your working project, when you render it, it's not there. And that's really cool because it means that you can retain your sketch layers and just lock and hide them, but bring them back when you need them to draw on top of or to use as a reference without them appearing in your final animation. So that is it for the animation part of this tutorial. I hope it hasn't been too confusing, and although it is a bit tricky to work out, I hope I've been able to guide you to some resources that will really help you understand and sink your teeth into the animation tools that Animate CC provides. In this next section of the tutorial, I'm going to talk about something called filters and effects, and this is where you can create some really cool glows or blurs and things that create some interesting visual aspects to your animation, and they can be used in very fun and useful ways. So to demonstrate this, I want to apply some filters and effects to the entirety of this character, but at the moment there are two problems with that. One is I have all the artwork on different layers, so applying filters or effects to the entirety of the character isn't really possible. And then the other problem is that his head and feet are made up of graphic symbols, while his body and arms are made of movie clip symbols. The problem with that is that graphic symbols can't have filters or effects applied to them where movie clips can. So to resolve this problem, I'm going to select the entirety of my character's animation, and I'm going to copy all these frames with my trusty Ctrl-Alt-C shortcut. On a new layer above, I'm just going to scribble with any line. I just need to basically make a section of art I can select and convert to a symbol. I'm going to turn this into a movie clip and I'll call it character loop. Hit enter, and then I'm going to double click and go into this symbol. I'm then going to hit Ctrl-Alt-V to paste the entire animation section I made, and then I have the entirety of the character inside a movie clip. So I can go outside now, and I have this entire character. I can now, if I want, delete these original 4 layers because I have one layer which is a movie clip with all of the 4 layers inside of it. But on the main timeline, it's one movie clip. So that's a useful little trick to use to put everything inside one clip. The other thing too is that because it's a movie clip, I don't really need the entire frame duration in the main timeline. I can actually just have the one frame, and if I hit Control Enter to test the movie, it will still play the entirety of the 100 frames inside the movie clip. Now I'm going to hide my guide layer underneath, and with my character here being a movie clip, with my selection tool, when I click on him, at the very bottom of the properties panel is this section called filters. I'm going to drag my library down and out of the way so I have a bit more space in my filter section so you can see it in the video. Now filters are sort of like effects in Photoshop. By clicking this little plus drop down section, I can add a filter, for example, a drop shadow. And as you can see, a drop shadow has appeared. There are properties in this area here, so I can lower the strength of the shadow so it's not as solid. I can add blur so it's a bit softer, and I can add distance and of course change the angle of the drop shadow itself. Now the cool thing about the filters is they affect and are affected by the animation. So if I hit Control Enter to render, you can see that my character's animation is followed with the drop shadow that I've applied. There are loads of things you can do with this. So for example, I'm going to add a glow. And you'll notice that the order of the layers affects how things appear. So I'll contract these layers here so you can see them next to each other. And if I drag one on top of the other, you'll notice if the glow is underneath the drop shadow layer, that glow is applied to the drop shadow as well. But if I put the glow on top, it's only applied to my character's shape first. So I'm going to expand my glow, and one of my favorite uses of this glow feature, aside from adding glows and magical looking, glows, is I can actually make the glow black and add strength. So rather than strength being 100%, I might make it 1000%, and all of a sudden the outline of this character is very thick. That's a really cool little way of using the glow effect, because that can create a really nice stylistic look to your movie clip or your characters, and it's customizable. I could make that thicker or thinner if I want. I could make it 8 pixels and have it very thick, or just have it 3 pixels and have it accentuate and solidify the outside of the character. So that's a really cool little trick you can use. You can of course add other glows and colored glows. You can blur the character. Now with most of these effects, there's the option to change the quality. This will affect the memory that it's using. So if everything's set to high quality and you have a lot of very intense filters and effects, it's going to start lagging a little bit. Now that doesn't matter so much when you render and produce it as a video, but when you're testing it as a Swift file and it's, producing everything on the fly, it will, lag a bit. So just keep that in mind. But if you're wanting to produce really high quality content, it is worth changing these to a high quality. So it means now if I have a blur at say 15 pixels, the blur is going to look very clean and soft if that quality setting is on high instead of low, where as you can see it looks a bit more choppy. So they're just a couple of uses of some of the filters and effects that I prefer. There are a whole bunch of other ones. You can adjust color with the brightness and contrast, hue and saturation, and so on and so forth. There's loads, and I won't go into detail in this video. I just wanted to show you how to add and change some filters and effects. But if you want to really dive into the depths of filters and effects, I have a video where I go into it and I created some flame animation, primarily accentuated by filters and effects. So I highly recommend you check out the video I created called How to Animate Realistic Fire, where I use Flash, but which has the same filters and effects options as Animate CC. In this next part of the video tutorial, we're going to talk about the libraries in Animate CC and some of the other features and assets that you can import and export and use, things like audio and graphics and stuff like that. So there are two kinds of libraries. The first is the default library, which I have open here, and anything which is a graphic or a movie clip or a button by default is put into the library. And that's useful too, because it means that you can click and drag and reuse and recycle any of these assets on the fly as you wish, which is really useful. Just for the sake of illustrating this, I can click and drag my character loop several times onto this stage, and render my little video, and all of them are in position and using the same character animation. Only one of them has the filters applied that I demonstrated in the previous section, because the rest were just thrown in as the raw movie clips. But the other use of this main library is to hold other assets that you may want to use in your production, for example, audio and visuals. So I'm going to click and drag a song from my Windows Explorer into the library here, and that just clicks and drags it, brings it into the file, and in the library here, my Baroque Coffee House song, if I press play. So you can test it out by clicking play in the corner there, and to apply it to the animation itself, you need to click and drag it from the library onto a keyframe. So for example, if I go into this character's clip, I might add a new layer, and with any frame selected after a blank keyframe or a used keyframe, I can click and drag my song onto the stage, and you can see it applies the waveform up the top there, and you can play it through in the animation. One thing I'll mention briefly regarding sound is that if you select it in the timeline where you have it pasted, there are a few different states it plays at, and by default it's set to event. If you want to be able to hear it as you play through in the timeline, so you can do things like lip sync and animate syncing to sound, you'll want to select this and change it from event to stream. And this means that as you play through, it will play through on your speakers. Another thing regarding audio in the main timeline is you can select a frame and right click and select split audio. That means that you can remove or move positions of audio, and you could, for example, select a chunk of an animation, split the audio and move the audio only for that section into another project. So that's enough for the audio. I'll delete that because I don't actually want it in the animation. But that's how you add audio to your library, and you could add images. So for example, I'll click and drag this button image, which is just from a Google search, add a new layer in my main timeline and click and drag my button across, and there is my high resolution PNG with transparent background, and this could be used in many different scenarios. So I might resize it, and if I wanted, and if I was clever enough, I could add code functionality to that button image and make it do something in the animation. But the point is, you can click and drag images into your library and then drag those into the stage or into your animation pretty easily. So that's how the library itself works. You can sort your library by adding folders. I'm going to drag the library out here at the moment because at the moment the bottom section was hidden by my head. At the very bottom of the library, you can see you can create a new symbol by just doing it from the library itself. You can create a new folder, and I can just call this stuff and click and drag all of this into the stuff folder, and all of a sudden it's accessible and hideable, so you can segment and organize your library in a very neat sort of way. And of course, you can delete content from your library by pressing the delete button. So that's pretty straightforward too. So I can select the stuff folder, hit delete, and it's gone forever. And of course, I can search, and if you type something like character, it will come up with everything with that in the title. So character head and character loop both have the word character in it. So that's the library itself. I'm going to drag this across here, and I'm going to drag out my CC libraries. What are CC libraries? Well, if you're familiar with them in Photoshop or Illustrator or Premiere or any other programs that utilize CC libraries, they're Adobe's way of marrying in the utility of various programs into one another. So my libraries, for example, I have this one library with the colors and the graphic of my character avatar. So you can add colors or raw images or vectors or art brushes to your CC libraries and use them in your Animate file if you want to. Some things will be more compatible than others, and at the moment there isn't much functionality in Animate to add things to CC libraries like symbols or colors, but these things will be added in time, and the use that you get out of the importation of CC libraries assets, for example, custom vector brushes, is alone very cool as a new feature to Animate CC. For the very last section of the tutorial, I'm going to show you how to export and release and publish your project. Now, at the very beginning of the tutorial, I did go through the publish settings, which is basically something we don't really need to go over again, but you can publish your Swift file, and to publish without previewing, you hit Shift F12, and then that does a publish, and then in the folder in which you created it, it is visible as a Swift file, which you can double click on and view. But many of you, and most of you I assume, will be wanting to export a high resolution animated video. To do this, you go File, Export, Export Video. This is where you can change the stage size. So let's go 1920 by 1080, and it's locked the aspect ratio. By default, you will want to convert by using Adobe Media Encoder, and to stop exporting, you'll want to go when last frame is reached. Now, at the moment, the last frame is frame 1. So I'm actually going to cancel this process and go up to 100 frames. In fact, I might go up to 300 frames. So I have a bit more of a lengthy video. So now I'm going to go export video, change again to 1920 by 1080, and then we can go export, because it's going to export to where I wanted it to go to. So now it has automatically opened Adobe Media Encoder, and by clicking play, it's going to export and render and encode your video. You can see it happening in the thumbnail on the bottom in real time. Now it's got a little tick because it's done, and I can open it up in my folder as a video file here, and I have a high resolution in 1080p video file of my animation, and it was as easy as that. So exporting high resolution, high quality videos using ANIMATE CC is easier than it's ever been before, and the process is the same with much more complex scenes. So this is another animation that I've been working on in Adobe ANIMATE CC, and as you can see, I use graphic symbols and movie clip symbols interchangeably, and it all looks a lot more complicated, but in using the same video rendering setup that I simply demonstrated before, you can create full, high quality, high definition, scaled up resolution videos using ANIMATE CC. So I'll have this looping for a bit just to show you the diversity of the animation that you can sort of produce using ANIMATE CC. This is obviously much more complex visually than what I demonstrated in the tutorial in this video so far, but I wanted to show the end result sort of looks that you can get using ANIMATE CC once you're familiar with it and with a lot of practice and hard work. So this is for an upcoming project of mine called The Tale Teller, so I'm only just showing this segment to demonstrate some of the uses that you can get out of Adobe ANIMATE CC, but all of this, everything you're looking at, was made in ANIMATE CC. All of the backgrounds, all of the character animation, the motion, it was all entirely made in this program. And I'm really hoping that you've enjoyed this tutorial. I know it's been a real long haul. This has probably been the longest video I've ever created on YouTube, ever. But I wanted to make a one-stop, one-size-fits-all, beginner-friendly entry-level tutorial to ANIMATE CC, and I'm hoping I've covered all the things that you needed help in, and if I hadn't, I really hope that the content I linked to elsewhere has really helped you. If you have any questions, leave them in the description. I'll do what I can to answer them, or other people, of course, who are familiar with the program will help answer them. And once again, if there are future things added to the program, go check them out in that playlist. And if you're interested in developing your animation skills and learning how to animate using the 12 principles of animation, make sure to check out my Animation Foundation course. That is it for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me, and until next time, I'll see you later. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for new content every week. If you want to support my work and get some goodies for yourself, head over to my store for archives, ebooks, digital brushes, video courses, and more. If you enjoyed this video, here's a link to some more content you might like. Draw with Jazza is proudly sponsored by Adobe. Join the Creative Cloud today and get loads of incredible industry-standard creative tools such as Photoshop, Animate, Premiere Pro, and other apps for your computer or mobile device. That's it for now. Thanks for joining the arty party, and until next time, I'll see you later.